All right, today we're tackling a big one, Thomas Sowell's Intellectuals and Society. We're going to really get into his core arguments about what intellectuals do and the kind of impact their ideas have on, well, all of us.
So let's just jump right in with a question, and this really gets to the core of what Sowell is talking about. It seems almost ridiculously simple, right? But the answer, well, the answer is the key to his entire book. How is an engineer different from a pundit?
And boom, here's the answer. It all comes down to one thing, accountability. Think about it. An engineer's bridge either works or it collapses into a pile of rubble. The consequences are real, they're immediate. But an intellectual, their idea is often just judged by, well, other intellectuals. There's no external empirical test. It's the difference between being judged by hard reality and being judged by a consensus of your peers. Okay, so before we go any further, we gotta be super clear on who Sowell is actually talking about when he says intellectuals. He's not just throwing the word around. He has some really specific definitions that create this kind of hierarchy of thinking. And you need to get this to understand his whole argument.
First up, we have intellect. For Sowell, this is just raw brain power. The ability to juggle complex and abstract ideas. It's being clever, it's being smart with concepts, but that's it. It's just the mental machinery.
Then he moves on to intelligence, and this is where it gets really interesting. Intelligence, in his view, is way more than just being clever. It's taking that intellect and adding judgment, and crucially, testing your ideas against reality, seeing if they actually work. This is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. And then, at the very top, is wisdom. Sowell says this is the rarest quality of all. Wisdom isn't just being smart, it's not just having a lot of experience, it's the whole package, combining that raw intellect with knowledge, with real-life experience, and judgment to get a deep, coherent understanding of how the world really works.
And this quote just nails it, doesn't it? Intelligence minus judgment equals intellect. It perfectly sums up the distinction he's making. He's saying you can be brilliant, you can have a massive intellect, but without judgment, it doesn't become intelligence. And that gap, right there, that's the foundation for his entire critique. So how does this all play out in the real world? Well, that brings us to Sowell's idea of verbal virtuosity. This is his term for the way words can be used to build these elaborate ideas that are completely detached from what's actually happening on the ground.
The key takeaway here is this. Language isn't just for describing reality. According to Sowell, it can be a tool to actually reshape reality, or at least our perception of it. You change the words, you change how people see things, and suddenly the facts on the ground don't seem to matter as much. Sowell actually has a name for this, verbal cleansing, and you can see how it works right here. He argues that a word like swamp, for instance, isn't just a neutral descriptor. It's packed with centuries of human experience. Bugs, danger, getting stuck. But if you call it a wetland, all of that historical baggage just disappears. It's sanitized. And once you do that, it's way easier to build a whole new narrative around it, one that might not be totally accurate.
And this isn't just playing with words, not according to Sowell. He says these new narratives can become so powerful that they actually start to feel more real than reality itself. You end up with this vision of the world that's built on carefully chosen language, and it might fit a certain agenda perfectly, even if it's completely at odds with the data. Let's look at an example he uses to back this up. He points to this one statistic. Pretty startling, actually. Take working Americans who were in the bottom 20% of income back in 1975. By 1991, over 3/4 of them had at some point made it into the top 40%. So why does that matter? Well, Sowell uses data like this to argue that a fixed category like the poor is more of a verbal creation than a concrete reality. He says it makes it sound like there's this permanent, unchanging group of people when the data shows there's actually a ton of movement. We get so focused on these static snapshots, these income brackets, that we miss the real movie, which is the story of actual people constantly moving up and down. All right, so what happens when these ideas, which aren't really tested against reality, get out into the real world? Well, according to Sowell, the consequences can be huge, absolutely huge. Let's dig into a couple of the high-stakes examples he brings up. He brings up the pacifist movements in Britain during the 1930s. You had prominent intellectuals like Bertrand Russell arguing for things like total disarmament, getting rid of the army and navy at the very same time Hitler was rearming Germany. Sowell's argument is that these ideas, however well-intentioned, created a political atmosphere where it was incredibly difficult for politicians to take the rising threat seriously. And in his analysis, that directly contributed to the appeasement policies that led up to World War II. And it's not just about foreign policy. Sowell makes the same kind of argument about economics. He points to policies that sound fantastic on paper, but because they're not constrained by real-world costs and incentives, end up having some pretty disastrous, unintended consequences. Rent control is his classic example. The intention is great, right? Make housing more affordable for people. But Sowell argues it's a perfect example of an idea that completely fails the reality test. Why? Because it ignores basic incentives. He says what happens is landlords stop putting money into their buildings, developers stop building new apartments, and pretty soon you have a housing shortage that's even worse than before. In the end, he claims, everyone, renters, landlords, builders, is worse off. Okay, so this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. How should we judge ideas? And maybe more importantly, if an idea isn't being tested against reality, how do the people who promote it defend it when someone pushes back? Sowell points out what he calls arguments without arguments. You've probably seen this. Instead of actually engaging with the evidence, someone will just dismiss an opposing view by labeling it simplistic. It's a clever way to avoid a real debate, right? The implication is that any simple answer to a complex question has to be wrong just because it's simple. But Sowell's comeback to that is just brilliant, captured in this quote. He says, "Before an explanation can be too simple, it must first be wrong." What he means is simplicity isn't the problem. Being wrong is the problem. The only thing that should matter is, does this explanation actually match the facts? A simple explanation that's correct isn't just okay, it's fantastic. It's not a flaw, it's a feature. So really, it all boils down to this. Accountability is everything. For Sowell, an idea shouldn't be judged on how elegant it sounds, or how many other smart people agree with it, or even how good its intentions are. Nope. The only test that matters is what actually happens when you try it out in the real world. And that really leaves us with this one last question to chew on. A metaphor that kind of sums up this entire discussion. In this giant marketplace of ideas, who is responsible when things go wrong? Who's left holding the receipts?